I kept mentioning like the 12 principles of animation. There's some like mini theory stuff. So we'll run through that really quick, and then I'll give you guys a short break, and then we can go into Maya and start sort of addressing any issues that you faced last week, and then get you guys set up to do the bouncing ball animation. All right, so how many of you guys have heard of the 12 principles of animation before? Cool. So I'm not gonna lie, I cannot name all 12 of these. There's a few of them that I'm very much sort of partial to and like trying to prioritize in my work. But it's based, 12 principles of animation is basically sort of a series of like rules and guidelines about how to make the motion of your objects or your characters more realistic, more believable, and also just have a little bit more character to them. So here's just like a sort of series of GIFs illustrating the different 12 principles of animation. And I find, so like some of them are kind of weird, like to me, straight ahead and pose to pose, which I'll go over shortly. It's not so much a principle, it's just like a working method to me. But there are a few that I find to be like really, really helpful to keep in mind when you're working on stuff. So a big one, particularly for the bouncing ball assignment, is squash and stretch. So you can see that like as this little cube sort of dances up and down and hits the ground, it squashes, and then as it speeds up or like changes speed, it's going to stretch depending on the rate at which it's moving. So that's a big one to sort of keep in mind for the future. The other one is follow through and overlapping. And that's going to be basically how does your object react to changes in speed. As a kind of morbid way to look at this, think of it if kind of in terms of like a car accident. So basically what happens in a car accident is kind of what's happening with the top of this little cube rectangle thing. So imagine like driving in a car, you hit a tree, and the car stops immediately, but you kind of keep moving. And that's morbid, but again, that's kind of like pretty much what's happening with the top of this box. So think about like where the weight is in your scene, how things are anchored down. Is there anything in your scene that would keep moving after something, in this case the bottom of the little cube, has stopped moving? Also kind of similar, I guess, to hair. If you're like, running or like turning or something like that, like if you whip your head really fast, your hair is going to keep going after your head stops moving. So that's follow through and overlapping. And then anticipation is, I think I mentioned this a little bit for some of the projects today, but that's going to be something where if your character or your object is about to jump, get a little bit of maybe like a squish down before it jumps to show, basically like build up to that motion. It both makes the motion look more fluid and more natural, and also helps give the viewer an idea of like what might be happening. Also consider just like if you've ever tried to jump on anything or like straight up in the air, it's really hard and nowhere near as effective to do it without bending your knees a little bit first. So that's anticipation. And then the other thing that I look at a lot is arcs. Most things in the natural world move in some kind of arc motion. Very few things just sort of go in a perfectly straight line. And I find that a lot of times adding a little bit of curvature to the motion will help make it look a little bit more natural. And if you think about it, even stuff like, riding a bike, like your knees are doing some kind of like weird elliptical motion. Like obviously your feet are going in a circle, but like your knees kind of follow that, and then even sort of the rest of the motion of your body, like if you've seen the sort of diagrams of how bodies move when they're like running or doing other motions, very rarely does any one thing stay in a specific spot. It'll kind of like move back and forth with the rest of your body. So arcs are a really big one for me personally. And then the other thing that I usually look at is timing. And that's kind of just an example, I guess. Let me see if I can. Ooh. All right. Can you guys see this all in the backish? All right. But it's kind of an example of, so if you look at the top box here, it's basically just moving back and forth in a completely linear fashion. There's no real acceleration or deceleration. It's just starting moving at a consistent pace, and then stopping. Versus this bottom cube, which is kind of doing something more similar to the default Maya interpolation, where it starts off really slow, speeds up in the middle, and then slows down at the end. Where in this case, that actually makes a lot of sense, because if you're pushing, something like a heavy box, it might take you a minute to get it started and to get enough force to move that box. And then it's going to slow down after you release it and stop putting pressure on it. So again, paying attention to the timing and how your object is moving can help give your animations a sense of weight and help things look a little bit more realistic. Apart from that, again, you can look at stuff like exaggeration, where this cube gets really huge to eat this little mini cube, and just appeal, which is kind of a weird and silly one, but it's basically how can you make your object have a little bit of personality, be a little bit more appealing than just sort of a static cube sitting there randomly in a box. So in this case, it's doing a little jig. It's using some squash and stretch. It's doing some sort of nice arc movements. And that's all, again, to just bring a little bit more life and appeal to that animation. So that's sort of the summary of the 12 principles, or some of the most relevant, I think, 12 principles of animation. Those of you that are familiar with them, are there any that you guys find to be really, really helpful, or that you find end up guiding your work more or less than any other ones? Yep. Yes.
Usually I'll have anticipation and mix it with slowing in and slowing out, where as it's doing this curve, it starts to slow down right before it drops to help kind of translate weight when it's hitting and landing on something.
Yeah.
When I had my Ladybug's head fall, I had it rocking whenever it would land, which caused the eyes and stuff to get knocked out.
Right.
All over, because it's far away, you didn't really notice, which I starting with the zoomed in pan, but
Right.
just stuff like that. That's the two ones I primarily use. Squash and stretch is one I'll try to learn more.
Yeah. I feel like squash and stretch makes more sense in certain instances. You wouldn't squash and stretch a bowling ball. But you definitely, a watermelon, but you definitely would for a rubber ball. And you definitely can, for your final animations, you're welcome to, squash and stretch any of your characters or anything like that, to give them a little bit more life. Even if you're using a fork and that wouldn't normally squash or stretch, go for it in the animation. Because they also usually wouldn't be articulated and doing acting. But yeah, anybody else have any 12 principles they're partial to?
When they hybrid squash and stretch with follow through for really exaggerated swinging motions and stuff like that.
Yeah.
It's almost it disappears into as it's coming to the front, it almost disappears to a vanishing point.
Right.
It's that hyper exaggeration really gets me.
Yeah.
With my bones.
Yeah, no, most definitely. And a lot of these are kind of tied together, where it's again, squash and stretch and follow through is pretty closely related, or at least can be if you choose to have them be so, et cetera, et cetera. Yeah, cool. Anybody else? All right. That's such a solid little GIF, honestly. All right. The other example, so I actually had a video that illustrated a lot of these, but the link has since broken, so never mind. Say again?
I was just
Oh,
reacting.
gotcha. It was Coyote Falls from Looney Tunes, if anyone's familiar with it. But, anywho, wait, all right. And then I just had in my awkward little Google Doc of things to go over. Strange behind the scenes of how I organize things. So I mentioned going over timing versus spacing for the 12 principles. So basically, and this is good to be aware that these exist. I have never personally found the need to refer to these by name or reference the principles directly. I just sort of keep them in mind for future things. But timing is basically the time between important poses or actions. So if you're doing something like a bouncing ball, the timing would basically be each bounce of the ball would be like one of your major sort of pose or actions. Spacing is how the frames are distributed between those poses. So again, for bouncing ball, it's going to be all of the sort of arcing through the air between the hitting of the ground. So, I don't know. Does that make sense? Any questions about that? All right. If you're ever doing something like a walk cycle, I would usually say that if you're doing like legs, for example, usually for me, I would do timing. I would like specifically key the foot motions as they hit the ground and as they come off the ground. And then the sort of arc as the foot moves through the air is just going to be like the spacing between those key poses. Apart from that, here's just another example of fiddling around a little bit with the timing to achieve different effects with your animation. It's honestly pretty similar to that little cube thing I showed you where like the top one was linear motion, pretty much the same thing here. So you can see that at each frame, there's basically uniform movement of this coin. So it's not accelerating or decelerating, it's just moving at a steady rate. Which is, again, great for some stuff like camera animations if you're doing like a turntable or something like that, but doesn't necessarily give a sense of weight. So here's a visual representation of the sort of default Maya interpolation, or like the starting off slow, speeding up, and then slowing back down again, where towards the end and the beginning of your animation, there's not going to be a whole lot of change in translation, but in the center, there's a lot of it that happens much more quickly. And this is, again, really good for, moving really heavy stuff, something that's experiencing a lot of friction, etc. And then just like two different workflows, which are, again, sort of part of the 12 principles, which seems weird to me, but whatever. But there's pose to pose, which is what I'm going to be showing you today for the bouncing balls. It's basically putting a few keyframes and sort of working on a whole rough animation at once, with a few keyframes to get key poses in place, and then sort of going out and smoothing out the interpolation between those keyframes as part of the refining process. The other thing is doing a straight ahead workflow, which is basically, instead of doing like key poses and sort of roughing the whole thing in and then refining it, you start at the beginning, get something that's mostly final, and then you just keep going and sort of finalize things as you go. Which makes a lot more sense for reference footage, if you have reference footage that you're working directly off of, to do straight ahead. It's a little bit harder to do that if you're just sort of like working without reference footage. You can do it, and I'm not gonna lie, personally, I usually do, but yeah. Apart from that, also, there's lots of different, for this assignment, if you need different examples of bouncing balls, just go on YouTube and Google bouncing balls. There's literally just people who have done videos like this where they're just systematically, oh my god, so much extra time is wasted with captions in this. But literally, this is like 7 minutes of just people dropping different types of sports balls from a specific height and seeing how they bounce. So part of the thing that is actually going to be due for this week's assignment is having reference footage, and that can be links or stuff you've taken yourself. But yeah, so please do use reference footage whenever possible, especially if you're not familiar with the motion of a particular object, because it is going to help your animations look much, much nicer. Anywho, that's pretty much, I don't know, I'm not going to make you watch 7 minutes of this person dropping balls, because that's terrible. So that was pretty much the sort of different stuff from that. Really quick, I'm just going to go over the assignment for this week so you can keep it in mind, the requirements for that as we go over how to actually do the assignment. And then after this, we'll take a short break and then come back and continue with the Maya things. So, bouncing ball guidelines, create an animation with 3 different types of balls or spherical objects, which have obviously different physical properties, and have them move around in an environment. If you want to do something weird like an orange or a plum for one of your balls, go for it. I've had someone try to do a water balloon before, which is like conceptually awesome, but also a colossal pain to animate. But yes. So requirements, at least 10 seconds long, and at least one of your balls must interact in some way with one of the objects in the environment. So that could be, you know, like a bowling ball knocking over a bowling pin, something really like a bowling ball being dropped onto a desk and having something fall over because you've dropped a bowling ball onto a desk. And then, it sounds really silly, but please, if for whatever balls you've decided to go with, make a model that is at least the approximate shape, size, and texture of that ball. I had at one point someone have 3 of the same size ball, and one was supposed to be like a rubber ball, and the other was like a bowling ball. And they moved through the scene differently, but it was really, really off-putting because there was like a ping pong size ball behaving like a bowling ball. And it just felt weird. So, again, make sure things are at least sort of sized correctly-ish so that you have an idea of what you're looking for. It's also going to help the viewer if they're not inherently familiar with like how a basketball moves. Having the visual aid of like, oh, this thing is orange and has stripes is going to help them sort of place in their mind what they should be maybe looking for when watching your animation. Apart from that, your environment must be closed. And by that, I just mean 4 walls and a floor. I don't care if you have a ceiling. I care only if I can see out of your empty box into the nothingness behind it. But I know a lot of people like sort of dropping things in from above. But yeah, basically the goal here is to just not have your balls be able to sort of roll off of a ledge and vanish from your scene. Like they should be fully contained within their scene. Even if you can't see all of your 4 walls in the frame at once. So don't feel obligated to like make a little box and like put your camera from some like crazy overhead view, which I've also had people do before. Like you can put your camera in your scene, that's fine, but just make sure that your balls are contained in some way. Any questions so far? Go. Apart from that, ways to earn more points, do nice models, lighting, texturing, etc. Sounds really dumb. Make sure it's obvious what the motion of your balls is supposed to be. And then also put the camera in a place where it's easy to see the balls, kind of like I mentioned. So you're welcome to move your camera around, but this is mostly geared towards things where it's like, I've seen every once in a while I'll get an animation where it looks like the balls have really, really nice movement, but they're so far away from the camera and so small, you just can't see what's happening. So please do make sure that, you're at least like putting, if you have like really small objects you're moving around, that they're close enough to the camera where you can actually see their motion. Otherwise, it just kind of tends to look flat and kind of bland. Goal for this project is get as physically accurate as possible with your ball's movement, deformations, and interactions with other objects. So really focus on making any motion that you have feel as natural and realistic as possible. Kind of same thing for deformations. I'm cool if you want to like exaggerate a little bit with if like squash and stretch on a rubber ball, that kind of thing. And that goes for your secondary objects as well. If you're going to have something fall over, make sure that it, feels like it's falling in a natural way, has some kind of appropriate weight to it, that kind of thing. I'm also not opposed with using other like non-round objects. Just run it by me before you start. Something really weird like someone should totally do a potato as one of their balls. Like that would honestly be amazing. But yeah, like I'm down with people trying to experiment. Just if it seems like super weird and super out there, just like run it by me first. But yeah. Apart from that, I'm grading you on originality of concept. So you're gonna get maybe a few more points if you do, something kind of creative with your scene versus just I am recreating reference and just systematically dropping sports balls into a scene. Model quality, texture quality, lighting quality, pretty much the same thing, and animation quality. In this case, for the animation quality, again, I'm going for how realistic is the ball's movement? Is it obvious what they're supposed to be? Are they like basketballs? Is it an orange? And then part of that is also a little bit like, is it a satisfying animation to watch? And again, part of that is maybe do something interesting with the motion of the balls, have them come in the scene at different speeds from different angles. rather than just systematically dropping one ball after another for 10 seconds. And I realize it looks like on all of the homework that I have done terrible math, and I will just sort of systematically correct this as I go, but that did not previously add up to 10 points. So anywho, are there any questions on the bouncing ball assignment? All right. If that's the case while we're here, I'm just going to really quick go through the analysis that is also due this week. So it's the analysis part 2 for the final. And that's basically going to be, I'll go through when I get home today, and I'll grade all your scene analyses, words, and give you some feedback on, you know, how you might approach the clip, like if something seems like unnecessarily over-challenging, etc. So when I give you a grade, please do actually, there will be comments associated with that. Probably would be good to give them a look over. But basically go and do a more in-depth analysis for your chosen clip, and please include, again, your official chosen clip, cut to the 30-second or so chunk that you want to use, and compress so it's not like a 5 GB file. And just answer the following questions. Like, what feel are you going for in your final clip? Are you going to try to take a serious scene and recreate it with sort of silly objects that are like all bright and colorful and kind of try to change the tone of the scene? Again, what objects are you using for each character, if you sort of change your mind or anything, any updated thoughts on that. Again, just kind of reiterate your thoughts on the environment. And then also go in, this one is sort of designed to think more critically maybe about specific objects you might need or like how you might recreate stuff in the scene. So are there environmental features or obstacles that must be represented for plot purposes? Something like someone's being thrown through a window and that breaking window is like a key piece of environment that like helps tell the story of the clip. How would you recreate that in your scene? Would you actually try to make something that looks like a breaking window? Or would you maybe substitute it out for like a paper screen or like a paper lantern that they're thrown through, so that you don't need to deal with breaking glass, that kind of thing. Fun fact, Ncloth does have a fairly reasonable to use little tear feature where you can like define where it's going to tear and then basically key it so like it rips if something hits it. So that might be one way that you can look into doing ripping paper if you need to. Personally, I have absolutely no idea how to break objects apart in a way that looks like breaking glass, so that's not something I would be inherently helpful for, cough. And again, kind of the same thing, but is there anything character-wise that, you know, they're holding or interacting with that would need to be represented? How would you choose to do that? Babies? Sometimes I go through and I read stuff that I wrote, and I'm like, what? My God, I was being so random. Apart from that, what are you shooting for your lighting? Are you going for like dramatic, spooky, trippy? I've seen some people do some real trippy, weird lightings, and it's like honestly kind of cool. But feel free to deviate again from the original feel of your clip if you want to try to achieve a different feel. And then again, just sort of thinking about what render engine you might use. You're not tied down to whatever you write here, but I know like Redshift usually renders faster than Arnold, which is good for long animations, but sometimes accessing it can be questionable on the lab computers. Yeah. You're also, for those of you that are game students, you are welcome to render in Unity or any other game engine if you so choose. My usual disclaimer applies that I have no idea how to do that. It's not. I've played with Unity a little bit, but mostly for coding and adding assets, never for rendering. So if you do choose to go that way, I'll do my best to help you, but it's not something that I'm familiar with doing and probably won't be able to help you troubleshoot. But it is open to you if you want to do that. And then, yeah, apart from that, basically just grading. You get 25% of the grade is literally have you answered all of the questions that you were supposed to, and then the other part of the grade is basically just like, are you thinking about your things? Do your answers make sense? And again, I don't need paragraphs. I'll just, you know, little bullet point list or whatever, just answering the questions is totally fine. That's pretty much the analysis. Anybody have any questions on that? Huzzah! In that case, let us do like a 4-minute break. I'm gonna go fill my water bottle, and then I'll be back, and we can do Maya stuff.